Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
What's up, fellas? Dominic rolling solo here today. Brian is on vacation, but he sends his regards. I thought a cool way for us to end 2019's podcast, and by the way, this is our first year that we did a podcast, so it's kind of cool to close out the year, was to record a shortened episode for you summarizing the most influential books that I read this year. Now, if you've listened to our show for any period of time, you know that I'm a voracious reader. I put down 20 to 30 books a year. Turns out many of you are passionate readers yourselves and are constantly seeking our recommendations and sending us your own. So I thought this could be a cool way to share my list with you as you are building out your reading list for the year ahead. If you didn't know, Brian and I have already curated 3 lists of books that you can download on our website at doinnerwork.com on our resources tab. The 3 lists are 12 books that every man must read, 18 books that every leader must read, and 15 books written by women that we love. You can go to doinnerwork.com/resources or doinnerwork.com, and there's a resources tab. And by the way, on that resources tab, we have a bunch of other PDFs available for download that accompany many of the episodes that we recorded earlier this year, like 5 practices to become a mentally tougher man. We summarize those 5 practices, put it into a 1-page PDF. You can get that for download, doinnerwork.com and the resources tab. And there's also one there called 5 Ways to Last Longer in Bed. Not that you would need that, but in case you have a friend who would need that, you can always download that at doinnerwork.com/resources. And that library gets updated all the time, so keep heading back over there periodically to see what's new. Okay, so before I launch into my summary of books from this past year, and I've broken them up into separate categories like favorite fiction, nonfiction, best leadership book, most impactful book, I think it'd be really helpful to share with you an awakening that I had around my book reading habits 5 years ago that has totally transformed the way that I choose the books that come into my ecosystem, that I dedicate 5 to 10 hours per book when I read them. And I think it'd be really helpful for you to hear this story as you are building out your reading list for the future. So about 5 years ago, I decided to start this practice of sitting down in December and looking at the year in review, the books that I'd read over the course of that year, because it gave me a real lens into what was important to me that year, where my energy went. And so it started to give me insight into, oh, wow, this year I read a lot of books on business because business was like really at the center of my life that year. That was interesting. Other years it was about spirituality or about relationships and sex and intimacy. What that point in time, that pause at the end of the year to kind of reflect on where I've been, allowed me to take a look at, okay, do I want to double down and continue this course, or am I complete for now, right? Have I read enough books on business for now that I can turn off that spigot and redirect my energy to something that I feel like requires more attention in my life for this coming year, like relationships or intimacy or sex or spirituality, whatever that is. And that has been a game changer for me because what I found is that at that point in time, most of my book recommendations came from like a certain group of people. When I turned that spigot on, like say the business book spigot, then those people would keep spewing more books at me and that would never stop until I decided consciously that it was time to put that on pause and to dial something else up somewhere else. And I had to go to a very different group of people for recommendations around those other arenas. So that's really important. But there's an even deeper layer to this story, and it was about 5 years ago when I looked at the 20 books that I had read over the course of that year, and an alarming trend hit me that didn't feel very good, that I didn't even recognize up until that point. And this trend was 19 of the 20 books that I'd read that year were written by men, and all of the men had written those books were white men. Now, I hadn't intended it to be that way, and I also didn't really know what that meant when I first came to that realization. I was like, whoa, okay, all my books are written by white men. What's up with that? But something didn't sit right with me. And so I started to dive into that feeling of what doesn't feel right. And a lot of stuff came up that like has forever transformed the way that I seek information. That's been so powerful, and I want you to benefit from the same insight that I had. So the first thing that came up for me was that I felt this tremendous sense of loss from the fact that my growth and personal development had been shortchanged by the fact that I'd really only been pursuing information through one channel of perspective, right? A homogenous channel of white male authors. Now, let's be very clear about this also. I'm a white male author myself. I have very unique experiences specific to me. Like, I'm a unique individual. Every one of these authors that I read also had unique stories that are personal to them, that have universes of diversity inside of themselves. And I benefited greatly from reading their works. However, when I stepped back and I looked at my collection of inputs from a macro level, I recognized that I'd completely shut down the worlds that were available to me that women could provide through reading their books, or people of color, or different sexual orientation. And I pursued none of those. And it was an unconscious shrinking or narrowing of my universe that I didn't realize the fact that, wow, I'm not only shortchanging my personal growth, but it actually wasn't in alignment with my own personal identity. And what I mean by that is I always thought of myself as someone who was deeply inclusive, that loved everyone, that actively sought out perspectives other than my own. But if I were really to be honest about it, and I looking at that particular book list, then I wasn't really walking the walk. And it allowed me actually to see further about the fact that most of the TV shows I watched were primarily white male casts or white male leaders. Most of my coaches were men, white men. And so it really kicked off this thing of, if I want to expand my worldview, and if I want to really have an accelerated path of personal development, then I got to get outside of this narrow niche that I'm in. And what I can tell you, fellas, is that over the course of these last few years, as I've pursued over half the books I've read, my intention has been either written by women or people of color or a combination of the both, seeking out mentorship from people of color and from women. My world has exploded. I've been considered much more trustworthy, particularly from women. Like this past year, I've spoken in front of a large number of women-only groups, and men are shocked to learn that I get invited in to speak on stages at women's groups. Well, it's because I've done the work. I've actively expanded my perspective. I've become more trustworthy as a leader. I could go on and on about this, but the reason why I share this story with you is that as you are inspecting your own book reading habits, and you start to also bump that up against the identity of the person that you believe yourself to be or aspire to be, do your inputs match your aspirations? And if not, this is the perfect time to really take a deeper look at that for yourself. All right, let's dive into the book list. So the first category is the number one author that I read this year. Could you guess who that might be? Drum roll, please. Napoleon Hill. Surprise, surprise. Unless this is the first episode you've ever listened to, you probably could have guessed that. This year, I reread two of Napoleon Hill's books, Outwitting the Devil and Think and Grow Rich, which you've heard Brian and I talk about ad nauseum on the show. I listened to another of his books for the first time on audio called How to Use Your Own Mind. But the book that I'm going to recommend for you, and it's actually less of a book in it, it's more of audio recordings, is Napoleon Hill in his own voice. Now, I was turned on to this one by my friend Cara, and it quickly became an obsession. This is a 10-hour series of audio recordings from his live workshops when Hill was still alive. And there was a 2-month period this year where I would every single morning put on my Bose Noise Cancelling headphones, and I would listen to these recordings for 15 to 20 minutes every single morning, first thing, and then again, last thing at night. And I did this for 2 straight months. No joke, I listened to these recordings 3 times through over that period and rewired my brain. So listen to this book if you want to reconfigure your DNA around what you believe is possible. And you can listen to these recordings on Spotify for free. And that is Napoleon Hill in his own voice. Okay, second category. The most impactful book I read this year. The most impactful book I read this year was White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. And this book was given to me by my friend Terry. Now, this book is perspective rattling and unapologetically confronting in the best of ways. Read this book if you want a wake-up call. And the big idea of this book is that the idea of racism is so uncomfortable for white people, as it's viewed as like the ultimate character assassination, that we refuse to look at how we are benefiting from and ensuring the survival of the various systems and behaviors and covert language that sometimes we don't even recognize we're using that perpetuate racism. And the impact on me was that I was inspired to take a good hard look at where I'd been dismissive, where I'd been defensive and ignorant in my own life. And it's led me to pursuing and devouring some of the most powerful African-American authors like Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Colson Whitehead. So White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And again, all of these books are going to be linked in the show notes, so you don't need to remember them. All right. The number one genre category of books that I read this year was around men's work. Also shouldn't be much of a surprise to you. So I read 6 books this year in the category of men's work. I'm going to link all of them in the show notes, but there's 2 that I want to recommend. Number 1 is Modern Manhood by Cleo Stiller. If you listen to the show, you know that Brian and I are big fans of Cleo and this important book, which came out just a few months ago. And you can go back and listen to our 2-part interview episode with her entitled Modern Manhood, and we did a live event with her here in the city. Read this book if you need help grappling with the complicated world of striving to be a good man in today's era. And the second book I want to recommend is King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore. This is widely considered to be one of the most important contemporary books on masculinity. Read this book if you want to create your own definition of what it means to be a powerful, loving, and trustworthy man. This book has heavily influenced our work here on the show. You've probably heard Brian and I talk about how the great man within creates environments where he and others can thrive. That comes directly from the king archetype. So King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore. Next category is favorite fiction that I read this year. I've got 2 books here. Number 1 is The Border by Don Winslow. This is the 3rd installment in a trilogy that Winslow writes about the brutal drug war that we are losing spectacularly with Mexico. Read this book, The Border, if you want a novel that you absolutely cannot put down. And the second book is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. And this is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about a runaway slave who escapes throughout the United States in the horrible tales of what she has to endure as she's seeking her freedom. Read this book if you want a beautifully written and heartbreakingly educational perspective on the America that some of us work so hard to try and forget. Next category is favorite nonfiction. I have 2 books here too. Mindhunter by John Douglas. This is the story of how the FBI created a state-of-the-art personality profiling system to help catch the most notorious serial killers of our time. You'll hear all about Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, and the Unabomber, and more. Read this book if you want a terrifying lens into the minds of the most brutal serial killers of all time. And for me, what was the most interesting part was how the events of their early lives caused them to careen into a tragic life of destruction. And they've also fictionalized this book and turned it into a Netflix series also called Mindhunter, which is directed by the same guy who did Fight Club. And I tore through that in a few weeks. There's a couple of seasons out already on Netflix. And the second favorite nonfiction book is The Female Brain by Dr. Luann Brizendine. Read this book, fellas, if you want to understand your wives, daughters, mothers, friends, bosses, employees, any woman that you care about. Just trust me on this one. Next category. The favorite book on leadership that I read was Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babson. And I listened to this one on audiobook. This book was probably recommended to me about a dozen times over the past year, and I finally relented and decided to buy it. Jocko and Leif are Navy SEALs who are now consulting people in the business world. They take their battlefield stories and apply them to the business landscape. The big idea here is that great leaders take ownership of 100% of whatever happens inside of his or her unit. No excuses. Listen to this book if you want to stick a dynamite up your ass. Jocko and Leif narrate the book themselves. Trust me, listen to it, don't read it. And finally, favorite autobiography is The Heart of a Woman by Maya Angelou. This is a coming-of-age story about Angelou's turbulent life as a single mother, a singer, and political activist that leads her into the worlds of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Billie Holiday, and performing at the famed Apollo Theater in Harlem. Read this book if you want to be whisked away in the stories of a woman who, hands down, lived one of the most captivating lives of all time. So there you have it. Those are the most influential books that I read in 2019. If you go to the show notes, I'm going to link my Goodreads account, which is basically like a Facebook for book lists. And you can become friends with me and see all of the books that I read this year that I referenced and the others that I didn't reference. That'll be in the show notes. And next week, you're going to want to listen to the episode because we are kicking off the year with an episode called Your Ultimate Guide to Reading and Retaining Books. And this is an interview that Brian and I did with a man named Giovanni Beckford, who is a software engineer at Google, who has a profoundly detailed system of how he selects his books, how he reads his books, how he stages his books, what medium he reads or listens to his books in order for him to retain information to be recalled upon at a later date. Trust me, if you are someone who invests a significant amount of time in reading books, you are going to want to listen to that episode. It'll blow your mind. I hope you enjoyed this list. As you're building your book list for 2020, maybe you found some ideas here. And if this kicked up any ideas that you want to share with me, please send your best ideas on how to pick books, how you read books, or just book recommendations. Send them my way. You can reach us through doinnerwork.com. Hey, if you loved listening to the show in 2019 and got some sort of value that positively impacted your life, then Brian and I would love it if you could head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and a review. We pour our blood, sweat, and tears into making sure that every single episode is high impact for you. And the more ratings and reviews that we have allow us to attract new audience members who can see that our show is worth listening to by your ratings and your reviews. And by having more listeners, that allows us to go out and get even better guests for you to bring on our show. So head over to Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating and review, and we've got even better stuff in store for you in 2020. So be ready.